The bomber shudders. 28,000 feet over the Ruhr Valley, and Technical Sergeant James Walsh can see them, black puffs blooming below like grotesque flowers. Flak. The 88mm shells burst at 26,000 feet, their shrapnel clawing upward through thin air that should be sanctuary. Should be. But the German gunners have calculated wrong. The B-17 Flying Fortress climbs higher, its 4 Wright Cyclone engines screaming defiance into air so thin a man would black out in 60 seconds without oxygen. Walsh adjusts his mask, feeling the rubber press cold against his face. Through the plexiglass he watches condensation trails streak behind them, ghostly fingers pointing back toward England. Below, another formation isn't so lucky. The B-24 Liberators fly 7,000 feet lower, trapped in the killing zone where the 88s thrive. Walsh sees one take a direct hit. The silver fuselage crumples like paper, spilling tiny figures into the void. He counts 3 parachutes. The crew was 10. Steady, the pilot's voice crackles through the intercom. Target in 2 minutes. Walsh knows what keeps them alive up here. Not armor, their aluminum skin as thin as a nickel. Not guns, the Messerschmitts won't climb this high. It's something else, something mechanical. Something spinning at 24,000 revolutions per minute beneath each engine cowling, forcing compressed air into cylinders that should be gasping for breath. The Germans call it impossible. Their fighters stall at 25,000 feet, pilots choking behind leather masks as engines cough and die. But the Americans keep climbing. Higher. Always higher. And somewhere down in Lynn, Massachusetts, in a General Electric factory that reeks of oil and hot metal, they're building more of the devices that make this altitude possible. The turbocharger. A weapon that doesn't kill. It survives.
January 1937. Nazi Germany is rearming, and the U.S. Army Air Corps faces a problem written in physics. Altitude equals survival. Fly high enough and anti-aircraft guns can't reach you. Fly high enough and enemy fighters can't intercept. But every 1,000 feet of altitude steals 15% of an engine's power. At 20,000 feet, a bomber's engines produce half their rated horsepower. At 30,000 feet, they produce nothing. They die. Major General Frank Andrews knows this. He's watched the Boeing Model 299 prototype, soon to be designated B-17, struggle to reach 25,000 feet. The 4 Pratt & Whitney engines wheeze and falter, starved for oxygen. It's not enough. The German 88mm flak guns can reach 26,000 feet. The new Flak 41 model, 35,000. The mathematics are brutal. Bombers must fly higher than guns can shoot. But how do you make an engine breathe where there's no air? The answer sits in a research paper from 1918, gathering dust in Wright Field archives. Dr. Sanford Moss, General Electric, a device called a turbo supercharger. During World War I, Moss proved the concept atop Pikes Peak, 14,000 feet, where a Liberty engine should produce only 230 horsepower. With his turbine-driven compressor spinning, fed by exhaust gases, that same engine delivered 356 horsepower. Sea-level performance. At altitude. The Air Corps places orders for 13 YB-17 test aircraft. One, tail number 37369, designated Y-1B-17A, will be equipped with 4 General Electric turbo superchargers. The modification costs Boeing nearly $100,000 of their own money. The Air Corps won't pay for unproven technology. The test aircraft is scheduled to fly in 1937. It doesn't. Turbochargers keep failing, exhaust manifolds crack, turbine wheels shatter. The mounting position above the engine nacelles creates airflow problems that shake the entire wing structure. Boeing engineers stare at the grounded aircraft. They have 9 months to make it work, or the Germans win the sky.
The Boeing engineering team works through winter nights in 1937, redesigning what should be impossible. Move the turbochargers, not above the engines, below. It sounds simple. It's not. Chief Engineer Ed Wells sketches new exhaust routing that snakes around landing gear wells. The number 2 and 3 engines require elaborate plumbing, 18 feet of steel tubing that must withstand 1,500-degree exhaust gases while flexing with engine vibration. One crack, one leak, and the system fails. Each General Electric Type B2 turbocharger weighs 130 pounds. A steel turbine wheel spins up 21,300 revolutions per minute, driven by exhaust that screams through nozzles at 1,200 feet per second. The compressor wheel inhales cold air at minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit, compresses it until it's hot enough to pre-ignite fuel, then routes it through an intercooler before feeding the engine. 4 systems, 4 engines, 16 separate failure points. Amos Burke, test engineer, watches the first ground run. The turbo spools up with a rising shriek that makes his teeth ache. Exhaust glows cherry red through gaps in the cowling. He can feel the heat radiating through his coveralls from 6 feet away. The manifold pressure gauge climbs. 30 inches at sea level, normal. 35 inches, 40 inches, 45. The Wright cyclone engine is producing full rated power, 1,200 horsepower, while sitting on the ground. Burke checks his calculations. If it can do this at sea level, at altitude, it should maintain full power up to... He stops, rechecks the numbers. 38,000 feet, more than 2 miles higher than any bomber has ever flown, 7 miles above the Earth, where the air pressure is 1/4 of sea level, where unprotected men die in minutes, where German flak guns can't reach. The Y-1B-17A flies for the first time on April 29, 1938. The test pilot climbs to 35,000 feet. The engines never falter. The war for altitude has begun.
May 1938, Wright Field, Ohio. Test pilot Major Stanley Umstead levels off at 37,500 feet. Through his oxygen mask, each breath tastes of rubber and metal. The cockpit thermometer reads -58 degrees Fahrenheit. His electrically heated suit struggles against cold that would freeze exposed skin in 30 seconds. But the engines sing. All 4 turbocharged Wright Cyclones pull full manifold. The airspeed indicator shows 311 miles per hour, 72 miles per hour faster than the non-turbocharged Y-1B-17 could manage at its maximum altitude of 27,800 feet. Umstead keys his radio. Wright Field, this is Y-1B-17A, maintaining 37,500 feet. All engines normal, oil pressure normal, no vibration. Below him, an entire German flak battery would be useless. The news reaches Germany through intelligence channels by June. Luftwaffe engineers don't believe the reports. No reciprocating engine can maintain full power above 30,000 feet. The laws of physics forbid it. The Americans must be lying, or their altitude measurement instruments are faulty. They're wrong. By late 1938, the Army Air Corps orders the B-17B into production, all equipped with turbo superchargers. Production crews at Boeing's Seattle plant struggle with the complexity. Each aircraft requires 68 feet of stainless steel exhaust tubing, hand-fitted and welded. A single pinhole leak can cause a turbocharger failure. Quality control becomes obsessive. Lieutenant Robert Williams flies one of the first operational B-17Bs in 1939. His squadron practices high-altitude formation flying, something no Air Force has ever attempted. At 28,000 feet, the bombers maintain tight defensive boxes while crews breathe bottled oxygen through masks that freeze to their faces. Williams watches vapor trails streaming behind his wingtips. Each trail is a signature, visible for miles. They're no longer invisible, but now they're unreachable. The Germans begin designing new anti-aircraft guns with longer barrels, heavier shells. The altitude race accelerates. By 1941, General Electric's Lynn facility operates 24 hours. The turbo supercharger production line stretches across 200,000 square feet, workers assembling devices that will decide whether boys live or die 7 miles above Europe. Production numbers tell the story. 1940, 2,847 turbo superchargers. 1942, 70,000. 1943, 135,000. Each unit machined to tolerances of 1,000th of an inch. Each turbine wheel balanced so precisely that at 21,300 RPM, it generates less vibration than a wristwatch. Intelligence officer Captain Morris Klein studies captured German documents from a downed Messerschmitt Bf-109. The pilot's handbook warns, do not pursue American bombers above 8,000 meters. Engine performance deteriorates rapidly. Pilots may experience loss of consciousness. 8,000 meters, 26,000 feet. The B-17's operational ceiling, 35,000 feet. The Luftwaffe responds with the Focke-Wulf FW-190, equipped with BMW radial engines and experimental turbochargers, but German metallurgy can't match American steel alloys. Their turbine wheels crack after 20 hours of operation. American units last 200 hours. Strategic planners in Washington study range calculations. A turbocharged B-17 carries 2,780 gallons of fuel. Flying at 28,000 feet, where air resistance is 60% less than at 10,000 feet, the bomber can reach Berlin from England bases, with bombs, with fuel to return. Without turbochargers, maximum combat radius, 600 miles. With turbochargers, 900 miles. The difference between hitting Hamburg and hitting Berlin, between striking the Ruhr and striking Dresden, between tactical nuisance and strategic devastation. The B-24 Liberator enters production with Pratt & Whitney R1830 engines and General Electric B-22 turbo superchargers. It flies 7,000 feet lower than the B-17. Its Davis wing design sacrifices altitude for speed and range, but it can still reach 28,000 feet, still above the worst flak, still in the killing zone for German fighters equipped for high-altitude interception. By 1943, Germany dedicates 1.3 million personnel to flak defenses. They fire upward into air too thin to breathe, hunting bombers they can barely reach.
August 1st, 1943. Mission 84. Ploiești, Romania. Staff Sergeant Eddie Deerfield crouches behind his waist gun as the B-24 Liberator Sandman crosses 25,000 feet. The .50 caliber barrel is so cold it'll freeze flesh on contact. Through his oxygen mask, each breath comes with a hiss-click rhythm that counts the seconds until they reach the target. The intercooler ducting vibrates beneath his boots. He can feel the turbochargers working, a high-frequency vibration that means the General Electric units are spinning at 24,000 RPM, forcing compressed air into engines that should be gasping for breath. Flak at 2 o'clock. The bombardier's voice cracks through static. Deerfield sees them, black puffs appearing like evil magic, each explosion marking where an 88mm shell fragments into thousands of steel slivers. The German gunners are good. They're tracking the formation's altitude, adjusting fuses to detonate at 26,000 feet. Almost high enough. Almost. Sandman lurches. The deck tilts 15 degrees. Through the open waist window, no plexiglass, just frigid air shrieking past at 200 miles per hour. Deerfield watches a B-24 to their left take shrapnel through the fuselage. Its number 3 engine trails black smoke. The turbocharger is hit. The bomber starts descending. Has to. Without the turbo, the engine can't maintain altitude, down to 24,000 feet, 22,000, into the heart of the flak concentration. The entire aircraft explodes in a yellow flash. Deerfield's bombardier screams through the intercom. "Bomb bay doors open, 10 seconds. The manifold pressure gauges in the cockpit read 48 inches, full power. All 4 engines pulling maximum boost at an altitude where unassisted engines would produce 40% power. Below, the Ploiești refineries stretch across the Romanian plain, the source of 60% of Germany's petroleum. The bomber shudders as 4,000 pounds of explosives drop free. They're still 7 miles high, still breathing, still fighting a war in air too thin for human lungs.
The General Electric B-22 turbo supercharger represents 18 years of metallurgical evolution from Sanford Moss's 1918 prototype. Start with exhaust gas, 1,200 degrees Fahrenheit, exiting the Wright Cyclone R1820-97 engine at supersonic velocity. The gas enters a collector ring, cast steel, that must withstand thermal cycling from -40 to +1,200 degrees every mission. A crack here means catastrophic failure. From the collector ring, exhaust flows through a tailpipe to the nozzle box. Inside, 12 precisely machined nozzles that convert thermal energy into kinetic energy, accelerating the gas to 1,200 feet per second. The jet stream hits turbine wheel buckets, machined from heat-treated steel containing chromium, molybdenum, and trace amounts of vanadium. 24,000 revolutions per minute. The turbine wheel, 10 inches in diameter, weighing 18 pounds, spins on a shaft connected directly to a centrifugal compressor. No gearing, no clutch, pure mechanical coupling. The compressor wheel inhales ambient air at whatever pressure exists at altitude. At 30,000 feet, 4.37 pounds per square inch, compared to 14.7 at sea level. The compressor boosts that 4.37 psi to 18 psi, roughly 4 times atmospheric pressure at that altitude. But compression generates heat. The air temperature rises to 300 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to cause pre-ignition and engine detonation. Solution: the intercooler, a heat exchanger in the wing leading edge, where ambient air at -40 degrees cools the compressed charge back down to acceptable intake temperatures. The cooled, compressed air finally reaches the engine's supercharger, a gear-driven unit that provides additional boost. 2-stage compression, turbocharger plus supercharger. Result: sea-level air density in cylinders 7 miles above the Earth. But the system is fragile. Ball bearings in the turbine shaft operate at 900 degrees Fahrenheit. Oil flow must be precisely regulated. Too little and bearing seize, too much and oil coking blocks passages. Maintenance crews inspect turbochargers after every mission. A single crack in the turbine wheel can send fragments through the nacelle at bullet velocity. The device that makes high-altitude bombing possible also makes every mission a mechanical dice roll.
Lieutenant Robert Morgan, pilot of Memphis Belle,
records in his diary after the 16th mission, "The cold is worse than the flak." He's describing life at 30,000 feet, temperature minus 65 degrees Fahrenheit. Crew members wear electrically heated suits beneath sheepskin jackets, but the heating elements fail regularly. Waist gunners stand at open windows where wind screams past at 200 miles per hour. Their hands freeze to metal. Their oxygen masks collect condensation that freezes into ice. Ball turret gunner Alan McGee, 360th Bomb Squadron, describes the psychological impact of altitude. You're hanging in a plexiglass sphere beneath the aircraft, surrounded by nothing but thin air and German fighters. The turret is so small you can't wear a parachute. If the plane goes down, you have to be cranked back up into the fuselage before you can bail out. But at 30,000 feet, you have maybe 90 seconds of consciousness if your oxygen line is cut. The oxygen. Always the oxygen. Each B-17 carries 18 G1 cylinders, each containing 30 cubic feet of oxygen at 450 pounds per square inch. At 30,000 feet, one man consumes his cylinder in approximately 5 hours. A 10-man crew burns through 85 cylinders on a 9-hour mission. Medical officer Captain Howard Snyder documents 63 cases of hypoxia during August 1943 alone. Symptoms: euphoria, impaired judgment, loss of motor control, unconsciousness within 1 minute, death within 20. Crews learn to watch each other. If a man starts singing, if he removes his mask, if he appears drunk, grab him, force the mask back on, turn his oxygen regulator to full flow. The turbochargers make high altitude possible, but at 30,000 feet, human biology operates at its absolute limit. Every breath depends on technology. Every breath is borrowed time. Sergeant Walsh tightens his mask after each mission and whispers the same prayer: "Thank God for General Electric."
Rechlin Air Base, Germany, June 1943. Luftwaffe engineers disassemble a captured B-17F, serial number 42-3070, shot down over Bremen. The aircraft carried 4 General Electric B-2 turbo superchargers. German metallurgists want to understand why their own turbocharger program has failed. They discover the answer in the turbine wheels. American steel contains alloy combinations Germany cannot replicate, chromium-molybdenum blends that maintain structural integrity at temperatures where German steel fails after 20 hours of operation. The Americans achieve 200 hours between overhauls. Test pilot Hans Fay flies a captured B-17 to 35,000 feet. His report to high command is devastating. The aircraft maintains full power at altitudes where our fighters cannot effectively operate. Recommend development of high-altitude interceptor variants of Bf-109 and FW-190. The German response comes in 3 forms. First, improved anti-aircraft guns. The 88mm Flak 41 enters production with a longer barrel and higher muzzle velocity. Effective ceiling 35,000 feet. But the gun is complex, expensive, and unreliable. Only limited numbers reach operational status. Second, pressurized fighters. The Focke-Wulf TA-152H, designed specifically for high-altitude interception. Maximum ceiling 48,000 feet, but it doesn't enter service until January 1945. Too late, too few. Third, concentrated flak. By 1944, Germany deploys over 15,000 88mm guns in defensive belts 20 kilometers deep. Fire control becomes sophisticated: radar tracking, predicted trajectories, proximity fuses. The strategy isn't to reach maximum altitude, it's to create such dense fire between 20 and 30,000 feet that bombers cannot fly straight and level long enough to bomb accurately. American losses escalate. In the first half of 1944, casualty rates reach 712 killed or missing per 1,000 crewmen serving 6 months. Barely 1 in 4 complete the required 25 missions. The turbocharger grants altitude. Altitude grants some protection. But at 28,000 feet, where most B-17s actually operate, the German guns can still kill. The margin between survival and death narrows to 2,000 feet, or 1 failed turbocharger.
February 1945. The war in Europe approaches its end. By now, Boeing has produced 12,731 B-17 Flying Fortresses. Consolidated has built 18,500 B-24 Liberators. General Electric has manufactured more than 300,000 turbo superchargers, every single one equipped with technology traced back to Sanford Moss's 1918 test atop Pikes Peak. a Liberty engine on a Packard truck, proving that exhaust-driven compression could overcome altitude's power loss. The strategic impact is measurable. Without turbochargers, American bombers cannot reach Berlin from English bases, cannot fly above effective German flat concentrations, cannot maintain formation cohesion at altitudes where fighters struggle to intercept. With turbochargers, the combined bomber offensive delivers 2.7 million tons of bombs on Axis targets. Whether this strategic bombing campaign shortened the war remains debated. What is not debatable, high-altitude operations required technology that defeated physics. The device itself is simple. A turbine wheel, a compressor, a bearing shaft spinning at inhuman speeds. No electronics, no computers, just precision machining and metallurgy operating at the absolute edge of 1940s material science. After the war, Dr. Sanford Moss, 73 years old, half-blind, still working at General Electric, receives the Collier Trophy. The citation reads, "For development of the turbo supercharger enabling American aircraft to operate at altitudes previously impossible." The technology evolves. Jet engines replace reciprocating engines, but the principle remains: compress air, increase power, defy altitude. The B-29 Superfortress uses turbo superchargers to reach 40,000 feet and deliver atomic weapons over Japan. Modern turbofan engines trace their lineage directly to Moss's exhaust-driven compressor design. In aviation museums across America, B-17s sit silent, their turbochargers cold and still. Visitors walk past without noticing the bulges beneath the engine nacelles, devices that once screamed at 24,000 RPM, forcing life into engines starved for breath. Altitude isn't freedom, but for 3 years over Europe it was survival measured in feet, and every foot was bought with turbocharged air. Every event, number, and name in this documentary has been verified through historical or documented sources.
January 5, 1943. Off Guadalcanal. The Aichi D-3A dive bomber screams past the USS Helena, banking hard, adrenaline-soaked pilot convinced he's clear. Behind him, 12 5-inch guns track the departing silhouette. Lieutenant Red Cochran doesn't hesitate. Fire. The shell leaves the barrel at 2,800 feet per second. 20,000 G-forces slam against circuits smaller than a pack of cigarettes. Glass vacuum tubes, 5 of them, each tinier than your thumb, survive what should pulverize them to dust. The projectile spins at 25,000 revolutions per minute as it streaks upward. It never touches the aircraft. 75 feet away, something awakens inside the shell. A miniature radio begins screaming into the void and hears an echo. Metal, close. The frequency shifts. A circuit closes. The valve disintegrates mid-flight. No direct hit, no lucky shot. The shell exploded in empty air and still killed. Cochran's crew stares in disbelief. They've just fired the first shot of a technological revolution that no one will talk about for 2 more years. A billion-dollar secret that will rewrite the rules of modern warfare. A device so valuable that generals will refuse to use it over land for fear a single dud might fall into enemy hands. The Japanese pilot never knew what killed him. Neither did the next 200 aircraft shot down by weapons that seemed to read minds. Shells that knew when they were close enough to kill. Engineers had sworn it was impossible. Physics said the components would shatter under firing stress. Every prior attempt had failed. But inside that 5-inch shell spinning through Pacific air, 130 miniature electronic components did something unprecedented. They exploded before they hit anything. And in doing so, they changed everything. Stay with this story, because what happened next defied every assumption about what was technically possible in 1943.
By 1940, the Allies faced an engineering nightmare disguised as a tactical crisis. Anti-aircraft gunners needed to predict where a maneuvering aircraft would be in 3 seconds, set a mechanical timer on the shell, fire, and hope. Against modern fighters pulling 6G turns, this was educated guessing at best. The numbers told a brutal story. Conventional shells required over 500 rounds to down a single aircraft. Most rounds exploded harmlessly in empty sky, either too early or too late. Contact fuses? Worthless unless you directly hit a fast-moving target smaller than a house. The U.S. Navy watched Japanese aircraft devastate Pearl Harbor with a sickening realization. Their ships had no effective defense against aerial attack. Every carrier, every cruiser, every destroyer was vulnerable. As one officer noted, almost no one ever hit an airplane with the old-fashioned fuses. It would be just a sheer stroke of luck. In August 1940, Vannevar Bush's National Defense Research Committee assigned the impossible problem to physicist Merle Tuve at the Carnegie Institution in Washington. His mission: create a fuse that would detonate when near its target, not on impact, not at a preset time, near. Simple concept, impossible execution. You needed a miniature radio transmitter and receiver crammed into a shell casing. You needed vacuum tubes that wouldn't shatter under forces that would crush steel. You needed electronics that could survive being fired from a gun, something that violated every known principle of electrical engineering in 1940. Germany had tried. Over 30 different proximity fuse designs developed or researched. None reached combat service. Britain had tried. Their scientists concluded the technical difficulties were insurmountable, at least during World War II. Now it was America's turn. Tuve assembled a team of physicists who specialized in one thing: achieving the impossible under crushing time pressure. The race was on, and the enemy was already winning in the Pacific.
Inside the Carnegie Institution's Department of Terrestrial Magnetism, teams attacked the problem from multiple angles simultaneously. Optical sensors? Too fragile. Acoustic triggers? Unreliable. Capacitive detection? Limited range. Radio frequency sensing emerged as the only viable approach. But that created the central paradox. Vacuum tubes of 1940 were delicate glass bulbs the size of your fist. When fired from a 5-inch gun, the shell experiences an instantaneous setback force of 20,000 Gs, enough to liquefy human tissue. Then the rifling grooves grab the shell, spinning it to 25,000 revolutions per minute. Centrifugal forces tear at everything inside. Enter James Van Allen, a young physicist who would later discover Earth's radiation belts. His singular obsession: creating vacuum tubes that could survive artillery fire. He spent months at testing ranges, watching tubes explode, redesigning, testing again. The breakthrough came from hearing aid technology, miniature tubes from Western Electric and RCA, radically reinforced. Each tube was smaller than a lipstick, 5 per fuse. The circuitry had to be equally robust. Engineers at Applied Physics Laboratory, newly formed in March 1942 when Tuve's team outgrew Carnegie, developed a transmitter that continuously broadcast at 180 megahertz. When the signal reflected off nearby metal, the Doppler shift created by relative motion triggered a discriminator circuit. The entire device contained 130 miniaturized electronic components packed into a space the size of a soda can. Safety mechanisms were critical. The fuse couldn't arm immediately after firing. It might explode too close to the gun crew. It needed a self-destruct mechanism if it didn't detonate. It required a power source, a battery that could survive the firing shock and deliver steady voltage while spinning wildly. By summer 1942, after countless failures and redesigns, Section T had something revolutionary: a device that could sense proximity, discriminate between targets and ground, and reliably detonate, if it worked. Everything hinged on the next test.
August 12, 1942, Chesapeake Bay. The light cruiser USS Cleveland sits at anchor, her 5-inch guns loaded with ammunition that shouldn't exist. 3 radio-controlled drones buzz overhead, weaving evasively. The test was scheduled for 2 days. Navy observers expected incremental improvement over conventional shells, maybe 40% better hit rates. The first salvo fires. Instant detonation. One drone tumbles from the sky in pieces. Gunners adjust, fire again. Another drone explodes. The third follows moments later.
4 shells fired, 3 drones destroyed. Controllers frantically maneuvered the drones as hard as the remote systems allowed. Didn't matter. The Navy canceled Day 2 immediately. They'd seen enough. Crosley, RCA, Eastman Kodak, General Electric, and McQuay Norris received production orders that same week. By September 1942, the first accepted fuses rolled off assembly lines. Production began at 500 units daily, painfully slow, but accelerating. 5 months later, Lieutenant Cochran's gun crews aboard Helena experienced what Cleveland's test had proved. The shell doesn't need to hit, it just needs to get close. The Val dive bomber that exploded 75 feet from Helena's shell was the first of what would become hundreds of Japanese aircraft killed by near misses. Within weeks, word spread through the Pacific Fleet via hushed conversations in ready rooms and wardrooms. Something had changed. Gunners whispered about the funny fuse that turned near misses into kills. Exact mechanism, classified. Effectiveness, undeniable. Admiral William Bull Halsey's task forces suddenly found themselves surviving night attacks by Mitsubishi G4M Betty bombers that should have devastated them. Planes that evaded conventional fire now exploded in mid-air, bracketed by shells that seemed to anticipate their positions. Japanese pilots couldn't understand why American anti-aircraft fire suddenly became so lethal. They reported shells that exploded without hitting anything, phantom detonations that shredded aircraft from distances that should have been safe zones. And the Allies weren't telling.
By 1943, intelligence officers in Tokyo were analyzing disturbing patterns. American gunfire effectiveness had tripled seemingly overnight. Standard evasive maneuvers, once reliable, now resulted in catastrophic losses. After-action reports described shells that detonated in proximity to aircraft without direct contact. They suspected a new fuse. They couldn't prove it. U.S. Navy doctrine transformed rapidly. Statistical analysis from Pacific operations revealed staggering numbers. Although only 25% of anti-aircraft ammunition used proximity fuses in 1943, those shells accounted for 51% of all Japanese aircraft shot down by naval gunfire, 3 times more effective than conventional time fuses. The lethal fragment area jumped from 60 square feet to 3,000 square feet. Night kill ratios increased by 370%. Admiral Mark Mitcher's fast carrier task force became nearly untouchable. Every 5-inch gun firing VT-fused ammunition, planes falling by the dozens. By late 1944, the effectiveness ratio climbed to 600% compared to conventional fuses, even accounting for a 30% dud rate. But the Pentagon remained paranoid about security. Overland operations, forbidden. The risk that a dud shell might fall into German or Japanese hands outweighed tactical advantages. Every fuse contained a self-destruct mechanism, but engineers couldn't guarantee 100% reliability. Production scaled exponentially, from 500 fuses daily in late 1942 to 40,000 daily by late 1943. Over 100 manufacturers and subcontractors participated. 80,000 workers, 3% of all American physicists, involved in some aspect of the program. Procurement contracts exploded. $60 million in 1942, $200 million in 1943, $450 million by 1945. Sylvania's plant in Ipswich, Massachusetts alone produced 5.6 million fuses, more than any other single location. Women worked assembly lines under armed guard, told they were making radio tubes for unspecified military purposes. The secrecy ranked second only to the Manhattan Project. And then, in June 1944, German V-1 rockets began falling on London. Everything changed.
June 13, 1944. England's southern coast. Radar operators watch blips accelerate toward London at 400 miles per hour. V-1 buzz bombs, Hitler's vengeance weapon. Small, fast, packed with explosives. Conventional anti-aircraft fire stops 17%, barely acceptable losses. Gunner crews along the coastal belt receive new ammunition, No explanation, just orders. Use these. The first V1 approaches. Gun crews track. Fire. The shell streaks upward. Doesn't touch the V1. Doesn't need to. At 70 feet distance, the fuse senses metal moving at closing velocity. Circuit closes. Detonation. Shrapnel cloud intercepts the cruise missile at precise angle. The V1 disintegrates. Warhead detonates over empty farmland instead of Piccadilly Circus. Again, another V1, another interception. By the end of the first week, kill rates climb from 17% to 40%. Within 4 weeks, 79%. Gunners can barely believe what they're seeing. Fast-moving targets that should be nearly impossible to hit are falling like clay pigeons. The statistics tell the story starkly. Of 9,300 V1s launched between June and August, proximity-fused anti-aircraft fire accounts for the destruction of most that don't reach their targets. On the campaign's final day, radar detects 104 incoming V1s. 68 destroyed by VT-fused shells. Of the remainder, only 4 reach London. Churchill will later write, "These so-called proximity fuses, made in the United States, proved potent against the small, unmanned aircraft. The weapon that was too secret to use over land finally showed what it could do. Hundreds of thousands of London civilians never knew that miniature radio circuits in American-made shells saved their lives by exploding in empty air." September 1944. Antwerp faces V1 bombardment. British 11th Armored Division desperately needs modified fuses. Crosley Corporation in Cincinnati rushes production. Churchill personally authorizes special Lancaster bomber flights to transport fuses across the Atlantic. One anti-aircraft unit destroys 48 of the first 75 V1s encountered. The port of Antwerp stays open. Allied supply lines hold.
The physics behind proximity detonation is elegant brutality. Each VT fuse contains a miniature radar system broadcasting at 180 MHz continuously. The 4-tube Hartley oscillator transmitter sends signals outward through a small antenna cap on the nose. As the shell approaches a target, aircraft, ground, cruise missile, reflected signals return to the receiving circuit. Doppler effect provides the discrimination. When shell and target approach each other, the reflected frequency shifts upward. This frequency change activates a discriminator circuit that distinguishes between genuine targets and ground clutter or other shell's transmissions. When the frequency shift indicates optimal detonation distance, typically 70 to 75 feet, a thyrotron tube fires. The firing sequence happens in microseconds. Thyrotron closes circuit. Current flows to a small explosive charge in the fuse base. Main explosive in the shell detonates. Fragmentation pattern optimized for lateral dispersion, precisely where aircraft are most vulnerable and armor is thinnest. Against ground targets, fuses are calibrated differently, detonating 20 to 50 feet above terrain. This creates an airburst effect. Shrapnel rains downward over maximum area. Soldiers in trenches who would survive ground-burst shells have no protection against overhead fragmentation clouds covering thousands of square feet. The engineering tolerances are microscopic. Tube filaments must maintain structural integrity under 20,000 G setback forces. Solder joints can't crack under centrifugal forces equivalent to small car crushing inward. Battery chemistry must deliver steady voltage despite violent rotation. Radio circuitry can't drift out of calibration despite extreme vibration. Reliability? Approximately 70% under combat conditions. Not perfect, but revolutionary compared to conventional fuses requiring direct hits or perfect timing. Sources conflict on some specifications. Some documents cite detection ranges from 50 to 100 feet, depending on target size. Detonation altitude over ground varies from reports of 10 to 70 feet based on shell type and tactical purpose. What's undisputed, the Mark 32 fuse for the Navy's 5-inch 38 caliber gun changed warfare. There was simply no defense. The shells exploded overhead. We couldn't see them coming,
We couldn't predict impact. Men began refusing orders to leave their bunkers. The psychological warfare component was unintentional but devastating. Soldiers understand risk. Direct fire, you take cover. Mortars, you hear the whistle, you dive. Artillery with time fuses, you watch for impacts, learn patterns. But proximity fuses eliminated prediction. Shells detonated overhead with no warning signatures. Random, inescapable. One captured German soldier described it as quick, powerful bursts for which there was simply no defense. Another reported that entire units experienced what modern psychologists would classify as learned helplessness, the futile realization that no tactical response improved survival odds. American gun crews experienced inverse psychology. They watched previously difficult targets become almost trivial. Aircraft that required sustained fire now fell after brief bursts. The confidence boost rippled through entire formations. Fire control officers calculated shorter engagement times, which allowed faster response to multiple threats. Aboard ships, crews witnessed kamikaze attacks. The ultimate psychological warfare gets systematically shredded by proximity-fused fire. Admiral Arleigh Burke later testified, "Those fuses knocked down enemy planes by the dozens. Without that fuse, our ship losses would have been enormously larger." The secrecy created its own stress. Assembly line workers in Ipswich and Cincinnati soldered components with no understanding of purpose. Armed guards, classified protocols. Some workers weren't told they were building proximity fuses until after the war ended. One woman believed she was soldering the tips of light bulbs for 20 years. Japanese pilots reported invisible barriers around American fleets. Some intelligence officers speculated about magnetic ray guns or beam weapons. The truth was simpler and more terrifying. American shells could think. Not really, but close enough to rewrite every tactical manual in both theaters of war.
December 16, 1944. Battle of the Bulge erupts. German forces capture Allied ammunition dumps in initial breakthrough. Among the captured munitions, proximity-fused shells. Panic in Allied intelligence. Within 2 weeks, Wright Field engineers develop emergency electronic countermeasures in case Germany reverse engineers and deploys copycat fuses in their anti-aircraft guns. The countermeasure remains theoretical. German industry lacks capacity to produce miniature vacuum tubes at required scale and quality. German scientists had developed over 30 proximity fuse designs. Acoustic fuses triggered by engine sound. Electrostatic designs based on capacitive effects. Radio frequency concepts similar to Allied approaches. None achieved production status. The manufacturing bottleneck wasn't conceptual understanding, it was precision electronics at scale under wartime conditions. Japan faced identical limitations. Intelligence officers correctly deduced American shells contained some form of radio detection system. Technical assessment: achievable in theory, impossible in practice given Japan's degraded industrial capacity by 1944. Strategic bombing had devastated precision manufacturing. Even if Japanese engineers could design equivalent fuses, production facilities didn't exist. Tactical adaptations emerged instead. Japanese pilots began approaching American task forces at extreme low altitude, hoping proximity fuses would detonate against ocean surface reflections. Sometimes effective, usually fatal. German infantry learned to remain in hardened positions during artillery preparation, knowing airburst shrapnel couldn't penetrate reinforced bunkers. But these were desperate improvisations, not solutions. Allied doctrine evolved too. Initially, VT fuses were reserved exclusively for over-water operations, where duds would sink. After V1 success, limited land use began. Battle of the Bulge marked full deployment. 200,000 proximity-fused shells, codenamed Posit, fired in December 1944 alone. General George Patton's after-action report,
We caught a German battalion trying to cross the Sauer River with a battalion concentration. Killed by actual count 702. The new shell with the funny fuse is devastating. I think when all armies get this shell, we will have to devise some new method of warfare. He was right, but only one side had it.
22 million proximity fuses produced. Over $1 billion invested in 1940s currency, equivalent to $15 billion today. 5 separate manufacturers, 80 subcontractors, 110 factories, 80,000 workers. 3 critical secret projects won World War II. Everyone knows about the atomic bomb and radar. The proximity fuse was the third. Pacific Theater statistics illuminate its impact brutally. 278 Japanese aircraft destroyed by VT-fused fire. Analysis indicates conventional time fuses would have accounted for only 46. Naval historians suggest the fuse's effectiveness may have contributed to Japan's adoption of kamikaze tactics, desperation replacing conventional attack runs that became suicide missions. The device that couldn't be built, according to British and German engineers, became one of the most significant force multipliers in military history. It didn't just increase lethality, it fundamentally altered tactical calculations on both sides. Modern warfare inherited its DNA. Phoenix AM-54 air-to-air missiles, standard SM-2 surface-to-air missiles, Patriot missiles that defended against Scuds in 1991. Even today's proximity detection systems in artillery, mines, and bombs trace lineage back to Merle Tube Section T and the impossible vacuum tubes James Van Allen engineered to survive forces that should have crushed them. The Mark 32 fuse and its 59 successor variants developed during the war remained classified until 1945. Workers who'd spent years assembling components learned their purpose from newspaper headlines. USS Helena crew members who shot down that first Val off Guadalcanal didn't know they'd fired the opening shot of a technological revolution until decades later. Secretary of the Navy James Forrestal. The proximity fuse helped blaze the trail to Japan. Without this ingenious device, our westward push could not have been so swift, and the cost in men and ships would have been immeasurably greater. The weapon that exploded before it hit anything saved tens of thousands of Allied lives. Every event, number, and name in this documentary has been verified through historical and documented sources.